Hi everybody, welcome to our discussion on this topic, which is leases. Friends, in this particular topic, in this particular discussion, we would like to talk about the paragraph 9, which specifically looks at the recognition of lease. Okay, the paragraph says at inception of the contract, the start of the contract itself, we need to assess, an entity shall assess excuse me, an entity shall assess whether the contract is or contains a lease. A contract is or contains a lease if the contract conveys the right to control the use of an identified asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. Now, it appears very technical to me as well, but what I would look at is my takeaway is that there is specifically that there is a right to control available to the lessee. Okay, and there's an identified asset. Okay, and within that right to control, I'm looking at the benefits arising back to the user or the lessee here. So precisely my entire accounting under the lease standard depends on whether there's a lease at first, which means if there's no lease, this standard is not applicable, right? So what makes it a lease? We say, look at it whether there is an identified asset, whether the lessee obtains the benefits, and whether lessee runs it, lessee drives it rather than somebody else doing the same, right? So there are three conditions. Any of these questions having an answer no, it means that it is not a lease. Okay, so any of the questions right, with the response as no, it means it is not a lease per se. Okay, right, that's what we want to remember. So specifically we begin with the first scenario, whether there's an identified asset or not. Okay, so we use this session to discuss something about an identified asset. All right, what is an identified asset? Well, in a very general meaning of the word identified, it means that there is a specific asset we are talking about, right? There's a contract wherein the owner allows the user to use that particular asset. Okay, it could be a very simple example wherein I say that, look, I probably will take a particular machine from you on a lease for a period of 3 years, right? And I shall pay you the rentals for the use of that. Okay, but I only need this particular machine, right? Now this machine becomes an identified asset for me, which means I'm not allowing you to change it at your discretion. If you are the owner of the machine, well, great, but then during the periodicity, I shall be using the machine for my purposes and it cannot be replaced until and unless, for example, there is a need for a repair or there is a business case where you would be able to, let's say, substitute that for me, right? But not at your discretion, maybe when I want it to happen, when the contract requires some repairs wherein the replacement could be sought. Okay, we go a bit farther on that and try to understand what exactly is the reference of this identified asset for us. We are saying, for example, there's a company X, okay, and it has let's say its head office is in the US and it has a subsidiary in, let's say, India. Okay, so considering the sensitivity of the business, what it does is it takes the cables for its data processing, for the data transmission from point A to point B which is like the head office to subsidiary and back. So these cables are taken on lease where the data is being transmitted, right? So when I say that you're looking at the designated cables for the transmission of data, now these cables are identified, right? So it is something which is very much available only to company X as a lessee or as a user of those cables per se, right? Now here we say that if at all the owner wants to replace these cables, it may only do that when there's a need for a repair, not the other way around. Okay, we simply say it becomes quite an example of an identified asset. Okay, now just go farther on that, and let's say that there is a company XY which hires a ship for 4 years. Okay, it hires a ship for 4 years, virtually, using the ship to sail through the the countries, or pick up the cargo, or conduct a voyage as per its discretion for these 4 years time, right? Now this ship is a dedicated ship, is a distinguished ship which is available from the owner to company XY, and the owner does not carry a right to replace this ship. Okay, so even this ship, for example, in this case, may be considered as an identified asset for the purposes of calling it, let's say, one of the parameters of leasing here. Okay, right? It goes farther. If I just use another example, let's say, so there is a city A and there is a city B, and you have, let's say, a factory where production is done at city A, and you have your market, your customers are based out of city B, right? So this is where you sell, this is where you produce, that's where you sell. Okay, so you may take a truck on lease, and it could be for, let's say, for the next 2 years, for example, right? And you decide that the factory production that happens here, you take up this entire shipment on the truck, and let's say put it or reach take it over there to city B. You come back on this with the same truck, you again load the goods here and unload those at ship city B, and keep on doing it for the next 2 years depending on the usage, right? So in this case, again, it could be an instance that the truck is an identified asset. Okay, but here we start arguing, here we start discussing whether it actually is an identified asset or not, right? Here we say that, for example, if I say that the owner of the truck can replace this truck because he expects some benefit out of that, for example, it can very well be a case that you need this truck every 5th day, right? So you are using this truck and you need this truck every 5th day at the city A, wherein you pick up this load these goods, and every let's say 7th day it reaches to city B, and it would come back, and that's how the journey keeps on going. So probably it can happen that the owner of the truck decides that I will ensure that some truck is available or a similar truck is available at all times on day 5 here, and it is able to, of course, unload the goods at the second day from the date of pickup, to city B. So to that extent, if the owner is able to replace that truck, substitute that truck, because he sees that there is a benefit he expects to receive by replacing or by substituting of the truck. In this case, the truck does not appear to be an identified asset here. Okay, so precisely in this case, we do not consider that the truck is an identified asset, and if that is the case, it's not an identified asset, it means the arrangement is not a lease. It becomes a more freight forwarding arrangement and not falling into the definition or scope of the leasing accounting standard. Okay, the same goes, like, say, for example, that I'm hiring a ship for 4 years, but the owner can very well replace the ship because he sees a business reason to do that. He sees more advantages for him to replace that particular ship. So it cannot be an identified asset. Okay, it goes further. If I say that I'm taking a space on hire, a designated, let's say, 1,000 square meter area to operate my shop in a particular mall, right? If the mall owner has a right to change my location from the original location to somewhere else because he might be receiving some extra rentals, and if he has a discretion like that, this very question's answer is not available now. It means that it doesn't remain as an identified asset, but for example, it becomes a general asset, and it would not be considered as a part of a lease anymore. Okay, right? It goes further where you look at, you are hiring a ship, designated ship, but only to the extent of 95% of capacity. Okay, you're using the ship, but you are only taking, or you're only paying for 95% of the capacity, but that ship cannot be replaced by the owner. If he sees some business out of the voyage or the journeys, he is allowed to use the 5% of the capacity. Here we say, in this case, that asset, for example, is substantially, okay, the asset is substantially an identified asset, okay, to the extent of 95% of capacity, and that would be considered a specific asset, of course, to the extent of that 95% only. Okay, here we bring that perspective of let's say, whether that specification, identification of the capacity can be done here. We say if it is substantially covered, then yes, it would be the case of an identified asset. However, in the same case, if, for example, I'm only using, for the sake of a number, 60% of capacity, it does not meet the very definition of identified. The substantial portion of the asset is not available to me for the purposes of calling it an identified asset there. Okay, now very generic examples. Let's say I'm an IT company and I use cloud-based servers for supporting my data, for storing my data. Now all these cloud servers, they can always be replaced, although they may very well mention that it's a dedicated server available to me, but practically the possibility of changing those servers exists, and the terms would normally suggest that the lessor, the owner of those servers, can always replace them because he sees a commercial benefit out of that, right? So in these cases, again, when we say that we are looking at whether that server, the cloud space, is an identified asset, the answer is likely to be no there, which means that those kind of arrangements would not fall into the definition of leasing per se. Okay, right? So that's something which we want to talk about in this parameter to begin with. Okay. Now, there could be an argument where we say that, you know, whether you know, the supplier, the owner has a right to substitution, okay, and he sees those benefits. Then we say that, of course, if those rights exist, then he can very well, you know, the owner can very well, the lessor can very well replace those assets, which means that it's not an identified asset per se. But then it goes to the next set of discussion, whether those substitution rights are substantive or protective, right? It's also to do with the control part of it. We'll look at the substitution in place, but briefly to look at it, if for example I'm using a ship, you know, for hire, I know that somebody can always you know, look at the right to protect, and that is where we start observing, you know, whether the lessee directs the use or does he obtain the economic benefit, which is just the next series of questions we would like to address in this particular, you know, the recognition parameter of the leasing accounting standard per se, right? So broadly, the first thing that we are trying to kind of, you know, address, the find answer of, is that whether the asset is an identified asset or not. We say if the asset cannot be exchanged, cannot be replaced, cannot be substituted, it is an identified asset. And it can be a case that it's for a significant part of a capacity which is identified, even that is permitted, but it is less than significant proportion, unfortunately not defined by the standard. Well, in principle, the principal parameter would fall into the place, the substance over form falls into place, than giving a exact measurement criteria or the benchmarking of what is substantive and what is not. So you bring more cases, more practical scenarios to understand what is your substantial capacity per se. We say that if the owner of the asset has a right to substitute the asset during any period, you know, any point in time, and he sees a benefit out of that, he sees a commercial advantage out of that, well, then the asset is not an identified asset. And if that is not the case, it is not going to be an example of leasing there. Okay, so we should be looking at answering the other parts as well, whether the lessee obtains the economic benefits or does he direct the use. That is something which is the next series of discussion we want to do with respect to this paragraph 9 of the leasing accounting standard. Thank you very much. Have a good day and take care. Bye.